Okay, I am so pleased to have with me today Dr. Adriana Berlingieri. Thank you for joining me,
Thank you.
who is a research partner and adjunct professor with the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children at Western University. I've been talking about this center, or CREVAWC, over the last few days. The center was founded in 1994 as a collaborative venture in response to a federal study on the problem of violence against women, prompted by the 1989 murder of 14 women at École Polytechnique in Montreal, the anniversary of which incidentally arises during these 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. The center's central mission is to facilitate the collaboration of individuals, groups, and institutions to pursue research questions and knowledge mobilization to understand and prevent violence and abuse, including forms of harassment and violence at work. So, to accomplish its mission, the center works with extensive partnerships within the university and with external organizations nationally and internationally, including researchers, labor groups, for profit and nonprofit organizations, community based organizations, and government. So, the whole spectrum. And among its many activities, the center provides employers with training and other resources on how to identify and respond to forms of gender-based violence, including domestic violence. And that training subject is something that Adriana's colleague, Margaret McPherson, spoke about a few days ago. So welcome, Adriana. Thank you so much for being
Thank you
here.
so much, Rika. It's a real pleasure, and thank you for bringing attention to this really important issue for workplaces.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very dedicated to this, and I'm happy to start off right with these 16 days of activism. And it's great to have your
Thank you.
input. Dr. Berlingieri has very kindly taken the time to review the case that we've been discussing the last few days. And before we dive into some targeted questions on that, I'd like to invite Adriana your any initial thoughts you might have on the case.
Yeah, thank you. So, just a couple of things really kind of struck me at the very beginning was the absenteeism, tardiness, the bruises or the other injuries that the employee was experiencing, the alcohol use to cope. These are all warning signs that an employee may be experiencing intimate partner violence. So we all really need to learn to recognize the warning signs, and this should be really part of the training on intimate partner violence that's provided by employers to employees. Research has also clearly demonstrated that these are also among the most significant impacts and costs of intimate partner violence to workplaces. In fact, we are now working on a project, and we have partnering with researchers across, different countries, and actually measuring the costs of intimate partner violence to workplaces. That includes some of the things that are part of this case as well. So, and I just want to mention also that it's particularly concerning in this case that there was a major incident that
Yeah,
occurred at work,
that's right.
and this really should be, a serious red flag for employers that there is a real risk not only to this particular employee but to others in the workplace as well. So just some of the initial thoughts that I had.
Yeah, and something that I know the research at the center at CREVAWC addresses
Yeah,
in some of the free resources that you offer to employers, and also in the training programs to help employers recognize warning signs.
absolutely.
So we can maybe we're just going to jump on the timeline a little bit, and I want to move toward the end of the timeline. In the case where the employer's lawyer is arguing at the hearing about why this individual, first of all, the termination should be upheld, but not only that, they shouldn't even get a conditional reinstatement where they have, like a number of requirements to meet, and if they satisfy them, they can be, reinstated fully. The lawyer said that shouldn't happen because, and here's one of the reasons. She says the employee has failed to leave her abusive husband. And so she has failed to eliminate the source of her, misbehavior in the workplace. essentially didn't get rid of the trigger for the alcoholism, the lateness, the inability to comply with reporting procedures, for instance.
Right.
So can you comment on how, is that a fair assessment, first of all, in your expert opinion? And can you also elaborate on how difficult it is for someone to leave a 20-year abusive relationship?
Yeah, so yeah, this is a hard one too because it has been going on for so long. So let me just go back for a moment and like on average, it takes a survivor of intimate partner violence about 7 attempts, if not more, before they leave their intimate partner violence. And something that we need to realize that unfortunately, with every attempt, the violence escalates. So we really need to understand the risks, the very real risks um, to this employee in this particular case, right? Or anyone that's experiencing intimate partner violence. It also takes numerous attempts before a survivor may actually disclose her experiences of
Hmm.
intimate partner violence, right, to a coworker or a supervisor. And these are in our research has shown that these are the two groups of people that a survivor may first go to, right? So this is why, again, the training on intimate partner violence is so very important for everyone. Um, because we need to be ready to respond in an effective, supportive way because we may not actually get another chance. That might be our only opportunity. So the employer's reaction in this case, I'm going to say it could be a little bit interpreted as a victim blaming, right? It's placing all or a lot of the onus on the employee who's experiencing harm. The goal should not be to force an employee or a survivor to leave an abusive relationship.
Hmm.
That is up to them, right? So an employer's responsibility is to keep the employee who's experiencing abuse safe, right? And to ensure that others in the workplace who may be also put at risk while they're at work um, are also kept safe as well. And we also need to realize that, I think we may talk about it later, is that being in a relationship for 20 years of this kind of abuse, um, it it can't all be left to the survivor to make those choices. The control has been taken away from her for 20 years. So that's something that we need to think about as well, right?
Right. I think that's actually a good segue into the next question, that issue of recognition, denial, for instance. So my understanding from the research is that individuals who are being subjected to violence in the home often try to minimize or hide it and have that difficulty of accepting help when offered or recognizing that help is being offered. Can
Yeah.
you comment on why that may be the case?
I mean, there are a lot of reasons. There's also a lot of shame and self-blame that accompanies intimate partner violence, right? And I have to say also other forms of gender-based violence. Unfortunately, there can also be a lot of victim blaming from others, right? Which survivors try to avoid. Regarding the workplace survivors, they can be fearful, right? That they might lose their job. They may be seen as the problem, or they may be seen as a liability, or somehow unprofessional, right? If
Right.
they expose their experiences or disclose their experiences of intimate partner violence. We also, I think, need to remember that in cases of intimate partner violence, especially when it's been ongoing for a long time, like in this case,
Hmm.
like I was mentioning earlier, the person experiencing harm loses control, right, over multiple aspects of their lives, especially over this kind of, long period of time. So, for example, the abusive partner may control who they see, where they go, what they wear, how much they spend if there's some in some cases where there's financial abuse, for example, right?
Right.
So accepting help becomes more and more difficult, right? And sometimes, in many cases, accepting help may be risky, even dangerous. And so there's a lot going on that a survivor needs to grapple with, right? When they're making these kinds of decisions.
Mhm. You mentioned control, and I know a term that's used a lot in your area of work is coercive control. Can we maybe unpack that concept a little bit for employers? Because I think that's, from my understanding, one of the more common forms of domestic violence, ultimately, because it touches on so many aspects of life. And maybe the average layperson might not understand what that means. And I would also add that I know an issue that CREVAWC has even identified in the legislation in this province is that in the occupational health and safety world, the focus is really on the physical violence, but there is so many other forms of violence before it escalates to the point of physical contact. So could you tell our listeners a little bit about the concept of coercive control, what that looks like, and what kind of impact that has?
Yeah, and I think they probably like I think I've started to explain that it's so imagine all aspects of your life being affected, right? Where gradually, if we think of this person over 20 years, parts are of her life are continuously taken away from her,
Hmm.
right? Um, every little thing even in her life is taken away from her, right? So she has less and less and less control, but with that also becomes isolation, right? Often,
Yeah.
right? So we know that intrapartner violence where survivors are often isolated from friends, from family,
Hmm.
right? They can't go out with coworkers, for example. So their world becomes very, very, very small,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
And so when we understand, and again, in the training for workplaces, when we can recognize that control and how that's showing up in someone's life, particularly how it may be showing up also in the workplace, when we know how to recognize those signs, then we can um, have a conversation with an employee who's experiencing intimate partner violence. We can, the framework that we use, right, in our training as well is we can actually talk about and share what we're seeing,
Hmm.
right? Um, um, in the lives of our coworkers, right, at work.
Yeah.
But we do need to understand, and so this is, for example, in this case, that the onus being placed on this individual to take the action when so much of her life has been controlled by someone else from her
Yeah.
abusive partner. It's very very, very difficult after so long to be able to then make the decision to even come forward, let alone take any control over her life.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I'd like to go back to one of the other points you raised earlier, which is the issue of violence escalating with each attempt to trying to leave a relationship. And you mentioned average 7 times, I think, before
Hmm.
someone's able to,
Or more.
um, or more, right? So, what are the kind of risks that a person might face with each one of those attempts? Of course, at the end there is the lethal outcome, which is unfortunately very common.
Yeah.
But what are the other forms of violence that someone might be facing with their attempts at leaving?
So I just want to point out also, I think we're going to get to this, but this the domestic violence death review committee who reviews cases of intimate partner um, related deaths identified high risk factors that such cases, have in common. And some of the risk factors for lethality include a history of intimate partner violence,
Hmm.
which is the case in this one, right?
Yep.
And separation is a really big one.
Hmm.
The survivor being afraid is another big one. Unemployment, for example, on behalf of the abusive partner,
Right.
all of which are present, right? In this case, right? Or
Yeah.
some of them. So there are very real risks that have resulted in survivors being killed by their partners.
Yeah.
Some of them, or some of these cases that we know of, occurred in the person's workplace, We know of cases that have occurred not in the workplace, but where co-workers and supervisors, maybe human resources, others in the workplace knew about, right, these situations. So there's a real risk. We often think this can't happen to our workplace,
Yeah.
right? And that's one of the reasons, found in some literature where why do organizations not take action is because we don't believe it's going to happen to us. It won't happen
Hmm.
in our workplace. It's not possible it's
Hmm.
going to happen in our workplace, right?
Right.
And so, but we do need to keep in mind that in this case, for example, this woman was assaulted in the workplace.
Yep. Hmm.
Right? It can happen that she's killed in the workplace or even
Yep.
at home. It could happen, and it has happened, that co-workers might be injured or
Yep.
killed
Hmm.
in the workplace, right? And so there are definite risks there that we need to really be aware of.
Yeah, you mentioned that unemployment is a significant risk factor, and you
Yeah.
might recall from this case that when the employer's lawyer made this argument about her failure to leave her husband as reason for not reinstatement, at that point when the hearing occurred, she had been out of a job for several months, presumably during which time, while she's unemployed, she might have been facing even more greater violence at home. And for the lawyer to say that, well, you should have left your husband, seems to be an even more of an unjust response to make, and certainly uninformed by the statistic that
Yeah.
she would have been probably facing greater violence at home after having been let go. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, and we saw this during COVID, right? Where there was like an exponentially increase in cases of domestic violence, right? Because
Right.
now, people were at home, couples were at home, always together.
Hmm.
Often the workplace represents a refuge for survivors,
Right.
right? They
Yes.
get they it not only represents a place where they can get away from the violence, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
From the home. But it also often represents a place where they, for example, can make phone calls
Right.
to family or friends. They can make phone
Yeah.
calls to lawyers,
Hmm.
if they're or thinking of or in the midst of a separation. Any calls for regarding the safety or the care of their children, for example,
Hmm. Yeah.
right? And so there are a lot of opportunities that the workplace can actually provide, right? Which we often don't think of, right? Because we only think of the workplace being about work, right? But it's
Yeah.
also a social place, right? Where we
Yes.
have friends that can support us, for sure.
Now that reminds me of something that you and I haven't discussed previously, but so I'm just going to throw something at you
Sure.
and see what you think. You probably heard that there was another omnibus bill that the Ontario government pushed for a bunch of changes to various employment laws in this province. And one of them is that it expanded the application of the Occupational Health and Safety Act to the home when people work from home, so to teleworking employees. And I made a post previously where I'm not sure that the government actually realized the impact of doing
Hmm.
that and the nexus between that expansion and the domestic violence provision in the Occupational Health and Safety Act about having to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for protecting
Right.
an employee. So if the home where there's an abusive partner is now the workplace, and the employer ostensibly has a duty to now protect that employee. And again, bear in mind that this really hasn't been tested, and I don't think the government meant this. But do you have any thoughts on like, is that even a workable obligation to place on an employer to now, when they don't have a line of sight into the home, but that's now the workplace where they have a responsibility to protect an employee who might be facing abuse?
This is such a good question, Rika, and a really, really important one and interesting one, right?
Hmm.
Because it is a bit we're testing that ground, right? I think it's inevitable. We are in a post-COVID world where we now have many people in a hybrid work situation, if not a completely home-based, right,
Right.
work situation. Um, so I think it's something that employers absolutely need to think about, absolutely need to start, um, you know, working with experts on ways in which they can keep their employees safe while they are at home.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the federal legislation has gone in that direction.
Right.
The ILOC 190 refers to the world of work,
Right.
right?
Okay.
Yeah, that's why
Mm-hmm.
also, in our work, we don't refer a lot to the workplace, because the workplace, people conjure up this sort of image of, brick and mortar and a
Mm-hmm.
door that you enter in and exit, right? And that's
Yeah.
just not the reality of work in today's day and age, really. And so this is why we often say at work, which includes all activities, all
Mm-hmm.
places, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
an employee is engaged in activities related to their job. And so, yes, this does, expand the responsibility, but this is also, it also provides an opportunity, I think, for employers to start thinking about this, to have working from home agreements that include harassment and violence, including intimate partner violence,
Right.
including sexual harassment and violence.
Mm-hmm.
That we heard a lot also, that change when it's online. We've heard a lot from workers that we've interviewed that, the sexual harassment doesn't stop, for example, when they're at home, right?
Right.
So it's about intimate partner violence, but it's also about other forms of harassment and violence as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, on that latter point, this bill also expressly expanded the recognition of harassment, including virtual forms of harassment. So that seems to have been dealt with. Although I kind of wonder if the original wording really should have been interpreted to include virtual forms anyway, but at least now it's an express point. But returning to your comment earlier about how this is an opportunity for employers to engage experts to help with setting up work from home policies that expressly address
Yeah.
IPV at home. My understanding is that CREVAWC also offers at least some form of that kind of support, and I know that employers are also encouraged to reach out to other organizations like the local shelter or violence
Yeah.
experts. I could foresee some employers balking at the expansion of this legislation, and certainly at my interpretation, which is that it now includes the home where domestic violence might be happening. And I can see certain employers saying, well, I mean, how in the world are we supposed to know how to even create a policy or a safety plan when we don't know what's going on inside those four walls? We have no right of access. And there might even be fear of exacerbating a violent situation at home if it's not done right. Do you have any thoughts or comments to share on, how reaching out to those other experts practically might play out into creating a workable solution?
Yeah, I think you mentioned also in the introduction of our center, right? I think you mentioned the word collaboration.
Yes.
I firmly believe, and I think I've written about this, that no individual, no unit, no department, no division, no organization can do this work alone.
Hmm.
And it shouldn't be the responsibility of a single person or department or organization to do. And this is why collaboration is really important. I mean, for example, in this case, right? So the employee is in a rural area, right?
Yep.
The realities of accessing supports, the barriers to accessing supports are there, more
Hmm.
so for employees in a rural area. Um, so when I say collaboration, y- this is also an opportunity for workplaces to form relationships before something happens.
Hmm.
This is part of a prevention. The prevention is to ensure that the violence does not enter into the workplace. And when it does, that there's immediate effective, supportive intervention, right? So form those relationships with shelters in the community. Form those relationships with community-based organizations.
Mhm.
This is not an HR issue. It's an entire workplace issue.
Yeah.
I've worked with and have studied organizations that have formed collaborations with other workplaces in their sector,
Okay.
right? So they're
Yeah.
sharing information, they're sharing resources. It's not about telling stories about,
Yeah.
it's in obviously with confidentiality, etc. But not all
Yeah.
organizations have the same level of knowledge. Not all organizations have the same resources, but can learn from each other. They can learn risk factors that each of them share, for example, within their industry.
Okay.
What have others done? Can they maybe form some kind of relationship or agreement where they can also implement that in their workplace, right? And so there's a
Mhm.
lot that can be done. Reach out to experts in the field. I mean, we're always happy to help um, um, anyone who has a question. Yeah.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard about the collaboration amongst organizations in a similar
Yeah.
sector. Do you have, can you give some like specific examples of things that they might have shared, one might have shared with another so as not to duplicate efforts? What are some things that they've done?
Yeah. So I'm trying to remember. So when I did my PhD thesis, for example, I did my field work in a major hospital here in Toronto.
Okay.
And so they formed a sort of committee where every, say, month or two, they would get together with other hospitals in the city as
Mm,
well. Some of them were big hospitals, some of them were small, didn't have the resources, right?
yeah.
And so, I mean, it could be something as simple as, oh, did you have a case? We had this case and we didn't know, and this is what we did. Does anyone else have any, ideas? Or we're thinking of implementing a particular initiative. Or it could be something like um, around education, right? So education we often think of as this once a year training or once every 3 years, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Tick the box. Yeah.
Yeah, tick the box. This particular organization did not do that. They did lunch and learns. They invited other organizations to come and speak of what was happening in their organization, what they were doing. Or maybe they knew about a speaker who could come in, or they reached out to us. We went in, did a lunch and learn.
Yeah.
They had events in their foyer at the entrance for public and employees about,
Okay.
how important it is, right? This issue for them. And and so there's just like it's limitless really.
Hmm.
But we're just sometimes so isolated that it's hard for us to think outside the box. But when we
Yeah.
have these conversations with other people, it really becomes easier. I would also, and this we've kind of really proven that it works in different organizations. Every level and every unit within an organization should be involved in harassment and violence
Hmm.
initiatives, policies, training, whatever it may be that the organization is doing. That increases buy-in, but it also increases knowledge within the organization,
Yeah.
right? And one could form a working group, literally a working group,
Yeah.
committee that where they come together and really talk about what's going on within the organization. These working
Hmm.
groups can then reach out to other working groups and other organizations as well,
But
right?
yeah, it's a great idea, and in the one sense, you think that there's already a framework for that because under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, you at least need a joint a representative, and once you have a large enough organization, you have to have a committee
Yeah.
that's at least in part not made up of members of management to have these discussions. But I kind of wonder if again because there's a general lack of awareness and also to your point about thinking that it could never happen in our workplace that subject just isn't being addressed by the existing committees.
Yeah.
So these hospitals that you worked with, I mean, it's impressive and commendable that they take that initiative to work with each other and learn from each other. I think it's a wonderful example. And I would presume that they've probably had some positive feedback too. I'm not sure if you've heard any feedback on it, but
Yeah, they did. And we actually took that model and applied it to a very large transportation company in
right.
Canada. And it was great because it's a process, right? We often think,
Yeah.
like we said, this tick box, it's a process.
Yeah.
We worked with them for over a year, but I tell you, Rika, they were doing their own training internally. They were reflecting on their own policies. They were reflecting on the ways that they support their employees. It's building the capacity from within so they don't need
Hmm.
us eventually. That's
Hmm.
kind
Yeah.
I'd be happy to be out of a job in that sense, in that sense.
Yeah.
And there's this, that company went from complete and total denial
Yeah.
that they had any form of harassment and violence happening within their
Hmm.
workplace, let
Hmm.
alone intimate partner violence,
Yeah.
to when we were wrapping up, they were sharing stories, their own stories of intimate partner violence that were coming to the forefront, of bullying, of sexual harassment and violence. And it opens up this space. What we
Hmm.
really, really, really want to do in organizations is we're not going to get it perfect. So I'm not, this
Yeah.
organization that I studied, I wanted to study them because they were attempting to do it right. That's
Right.
all we can do,
Yeah.
right? And so what happens is we open up a space where intimate partner violence, for example, is not a private issue. It's not something we say, that's not my business,
Hmm.
right? It's something that we can talk about openly. How I often ask organizations, what are you doing to make it okay to talk about these issues just publicly within the organization?
Yeah.
It's okay. There are no barriers to talking about this. This means people will come forward. We want reports to come up because it means that people are right to go out,
Yeah.
especially after training, et cetera, or policy implementation,
Hmm.
because they're feeling comfortable to come
Yeah.
forward, right? They're feeling
Yeah.
safe to come forward.
Hmm.
And that's really the goal. And there's so many other things that organizations can do.
Well, it sounds like a real culture shift happened at that organization, and it reminds me of something that Margaret McPherson had raised, which is that addressing violence in the workplace, including domestic violence, it's not just an OSHA matter, but it plays into broader corporate social responsibility and also
Yes.
the ESG efforts that they put into the reports to the public, for instance. And like you were saying, are we creating an environment where people can feel comfortable coming forward? I mean, that and the consequent culture shift, I think, does inevitably create a
Yeah.
more socially responsible organization.
Can I add also that
Yes.
intimate partner violence, sexual harassment and violence, other forms of gender-based violence, bullying, all cost the organization a lot of money.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
a, it's not only the right thing to do to address it, it's the good business thing to do, right? And if you go to our website, there are resources there on how much all of those things that I just mentioned cost the organization. It is
Yes.
possible to calculate that, which is what we're doing with organizations now in Canada. We've brought in a researcher and his methodology from South America, and we're applying it here in Canada. We can measure it dollar for dollar, cent by cent, and how much the return on investment is when organizations provide the resources for this. And it's faster than one might think.
Okay.
It's a good business sense. And we're working with specific organizations. So we will measure how much it costs for that specific organization.
Oh, that's, I mean, I didn't
Yeah,
even know that that was
yeah,
possible because I
yeah.
I think the last time I saw any figures on this was a report based on a countrywide survey that your organization did a few years ago now, and it did give a dollar figure for overall cost to employers in Canada. So this is a great new targeted initiative.
Yeah.
And am I understanding correctly that any organization can approach you to get that kind of assessment?
Um, we're recruiting, so we have some already. And
Okay.
so I can offer you that I can send you the name of the person that they can contact, or they can contact me and I'll put them into contact
Okay.
with them as well.
Yeah.
And so it's good because then organizations will know what's going on in their organization. And it's
Mm-hmm.
very,
Mm-hmm.
and we often talk about culture shift, like you were saying, right? Or change in a kind of global way.
Yeah.
But I think it leaves organizations thinking, okay, how do I do that in our organization?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Right? So, and I think when you have those more targeted kinds of initiatives,
Yep.
and I always say to organizations also, learn about your organization. Reports, investigations, disclosures, what is learned in training and discussions, those are all ways that organizations learn about the organization
Mm-hmm.
internally.
Mm-hmm.
And listening and learning in that way over time is where you get better and better and better and better at
Mm-hmm.
it.
Yep.
Yeah. It's a continuous engagement with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, that organization you're working with, they were trying, and that
Yeah.
was the main point. They're trying their
Yeah.
best. I wanted to pick up on something you had mentioned earlier, which is organizations being in denial about domestic violence showing up in their particular workplace.
Yeah.
And I know there are statistics, including that CREVAWC had put out based on surveys about the frequency of domestic violence. So I saw numbers that, around a third of women have experienced or been subjected to domestic violence. Of course, within that group, trans women in particular face an even higher
Yeah.
number. And then of the people who reported having ever lived with domestic violence, I think over half said that it came to the workplace. So I know of those stats, but do you have an understanding of, like, let's say at any given time, statistically, how many people, what percentage of the population is dealing with domestic violence at home? And so that we can translate that to at any given time is a given workplace dealing with an employee or has an employee rather who may be
Yeah.
experiencing domestic violence. Can you speak on that?
Yeah. So I'm going to ask every employer who is listening to this to, or, to think about how many employees they have in their workplace right now, in this very moment. And if they don't know how many employees they have in their entire organization, maybe think about how many employees they have in their department or their division or unit even. Multiply that by 6.5%. And statistically, that would be how many people you currently have,
Mhm.
currently, not in the past, currently who may be experiencing intimate partner violence right now. So that's a wake up call, right? That's a
6.5%.
Yeah, that's a wake up call right now. Think
Yeah.
about also, the people who may have left your organization, because a
Hmm.
good amount also leave because they cannot, right, function at work or do not have the supports. So again, that goes back to the impacts and costs to the workplace as well, right? And so that is a real wake up call, as I said, right? If we think about it. And so what we don't have right now are some, that was more in 2014 study. What we should do is repeat that study to find out
Yeah.
where we're at right now with those figures, but that gives you a sense. And think about the composition of your workplace. If you have more, for example, more women working in your workplace, more
Hmm.
marginalized members of our society working in your workplace, you think that might be actually higher.
Right. And to expand on that a little bit more, I know from that study there was also a report of the percentage of people, respondents who said they lost their jobs directly
Yeah,
because of domestic violence. And I think that number was also quite high at
8.
8.5% or so.
Yes, yeah, and not just our study. There are other studies that have shown the same.
Yeah,
Yeah, and so even exit interviews can be an important source
right.
of information for employers.
Hmm.
Why are they leaving? That's a huge, and think of that's those are employees who are experiencing domestic violence. Workplaces also have the abusive partners working in their
Right.
workplace as well, and so those are also right, costs and impacts to the workplace as well.
Hmm.
And in that study, I told you that, I was talking about that we're doing, we measure both,
Right.
right? And so that's important to do as well.
And I know there are a number of resources that CREVAWC offers on how to, I don't know what the better word is, support an employee who might be the abuser in that
Yeah,
case. And so my understanding is the literature says that it's not a good idea to just get rid of them, because terminating their employment might actually make the problem worse,
yeah.
and that finding ways to provide support or therapy so that might be a better solution. I know we're digressing a bit. Would you like to expand
Yeah,
on that at all?
yeah, I do. I think we need to be careful because we're not saying that there's no accountability,
Right. Yeah.
right? There is accountability. There is, accountability can look very, in a lot of different ways. There can be a progressive accountability model
Hmm.
that one uses in the organization with regards to intimate partner violence, but also within regards to other forms of harassment and violence in the workplace as well. And so I think it's two things that we need to hold is we can hold someone accountable while at the same time offering supports to change their
Yeah.
behavior, right?
Hmm.
And so we can do that together. And again, if organizations are thinking, well, how do I do that? Reach out to the experts, right?
Yeah.
Reach out to other organizations who have been doing this. We can do both. We can
Hmm.
give the opportunities to change, right? And research shows
Yeah. Yeah.
most will, right? And so we want to be able to open up that possibility. But it's also important to have really comprehensive, for example, policies that state that as well, so that
Hmm.
employees know exactly what will happen if they engage, right? What is the
Yeah.
expected behavior and what will happen if you engage in abusive behavior at
Hmm.
work, right?
Hmm.
And along with everything else that should be part of a policy, right?
Yeah.
A policy is a guide. It's a living document. It's a guide. It's a cornerstone to all the other practices that you have in your organization to prevent and intervene with harassment and violence in all its
Right.
forms in the workplace.
Hmm. And legally required too. So there's already a
And legally
document.
required. Yeah, there
Yeah.
you go.
They can
Yeah.
plug it in. Exactly. I'd like to turn back to the case, like, so we can just
Hmm.
talk about some specific examples.
Yeah.
I'd love to get your expert views on it. And there were a number of things that stood out to me, and I discussed this with some of the other people in the other interviews, where the employer seemed to go through offering supports that, on their face were really generous in many respects, like a residential treatment program, for instance.
Yeah.
But the way that the lawyer presented them at the hearing is, we offered them and would have made it available if she had asked for it, but she didn't ask for it,
Hmm.
so we didn't pursue it. That seemed to be the repeating trend through the entire series of events at issue in the hearing.
Yeah.
So I'd love to get your thoughts on, where, on one hand, the employer is offering to make a difference for this person, but
Yeah.
where could they have done things differently so that the impact would have matched the intention? So the first example was they offered to transfer her to another store location if she asked for it, and but she didn't, so they never transferred her. And keep in mind, like you said, this is a rural location too,
Yeah.
and she
Yeah.
doesn't have a car. She has no car. That's, I think,
Oh,
important.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So I think we may have mentioned some of this, or forgive me if I repeat myself, but we have learned from past cases of intimate partner violence, specifically within workplaces, that the survivor is often the one who is forced to coordinate, right? All the aspects of her safety while at work. So she may be dealing with her supervisor. She may have to disclose, for example. She may be fearful that her absenteeism, for example, or being late, etc., may be influencing her work and the security of her job. She may be dealing with HR. She may be dealing with security, right? She's dealing
Mm-hmm.
with her colleagues who often, right, are involved in the situation, and so on and so on, right? And so at the same time, she's also dealing with issues at home, right? She's dealing with
Yeah.
related to her situation. If she's in a situation of separation, she may be dealing with children. There's so much that she's trying to coordinate, right? All at the same time while trying to perform at work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So employees can also be supported. They can be kept safe even if they don't directly ask for it. But I'm not saying in any way that action should be taken without informing the person. Quite the opposite, right? So
Mm-hmm.
survivors should always, always be kept in the center of any decisions and should always be informed. And I think some of your other guests have said that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but any actions taken, you also need to learn that that could place her at risk. And that may also be something that in this case she was thinking of as well.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's something that to consider as well. Um, Even if the employee does not ask for a plan, in some cases, an employer can conduct a risk assessment and maybe, right, develop a safety plan that includes the workplace to keep
Yeah.
employees and others, safe while they're at work. This is not ideal, obviously, as employees should always, as I said, be at the center of any of those decisions and actions. But employers have that responsibility, right, to keep everyone in the workplace safe. Um, i- this is a hard one, I know, because like, oh, you didn't ask for it. And so, often, like we were saying earlier, also, it's very hard to come forward,
Mm-hmm.
right? Especially when, in this case, she's casually employed as well.
Yeah.
That's her reality as well,
Yes.
right? Um, and so, though all those realities of her life need to be taken into effect, and the employer
Mm-hmm.
can do a lot be without having to wait for the employee, right? Or putting the all the onus on the employee as
Right.
well. Sometimes it may just start as a conversation, and Margaret may have talked about this, and we teach that, right, in our training.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe just you've done that, and that might have to be enough for a while,
Yep.
and then you just continually see monitor.
Mm-hmm.
But to leave it all to an employee to come forward, especially in really difficult and dangerous situations as this one, it's very risky. It's very risky for her, but also very risky for the workplace and everyone in it.
Right. Well, on that subject of risk to the whole workplace, and you mentioned
Yeah.
the violent incident response plan, which was the second example I was going to get into. So similar approach. They said, well, we would prepare a violent incident response plan if she asked for it, but she didn't. And on that subject, I have some input as an employment lawyer that,
Yeah.
under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, especially since they now know that there is a violent person who does attend at the workplace, because there was an incident where other employees had to call 911 at work. I mean,
Hmm.
once that event has happened, I do question whether the employer might have actually been offside of their statutory obligations at that point to not create a violent incident response plan, regardless of whether she was in a place where she could personally participate. They should have taken steps at that point to make sure that if this guy shows up again, that we're ready to respond, and that all employees who might be exposed to this man are adequately protected.
Yeah.
So I think, legally there was not just a missed opportunity, a missed obligation, frankly.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you
Interesting.
had
Yeah.
anything else to add on that
Yeah.
example.
When I read this case, I thought, wow, it has not only entered into the workplace, but it was a very serious incident, right? And so then a lot of questions went off in my mind. Do they have a procedure that is in the policy outlined around imminent danger, right? Or imminent
Yeah.
risk? Um, was anyone informed, again, with the survivor's um, consent, right? Were the workplace, were her immediate co-workers informed? Was security informed? There are so many things that other organizations have done as well. I mean, I've even seen organizations of this idea in the States of a card, and you know, when there's a restraining order, for example, and a card with a picture of the abusive partner is given to security and others
Okay.
with a permit, like, so they, oh, okay, well, this person just made it in through the workplace doors.
Yeah.
Like, what's going on, right? And so it's what I also refer to as, you know, when we're talking about the collaboration,
Hmm.
it's creating a circle of safety
Yeah.
around the survivor, and the workplace is a really important part of that circle of safety, along
Hmm.
with all the others.
Hmm. Absolutely. The final example I wanted to raise with you, again, same approach by the
Mhm.
employer, was they offered to place the employee in a residential treatment program for substance use disorders. And of course, she declined. And so they said, so we didn't pursue it further. And I'll remind you of some relevant considerations here that, she was in a small community, didn't have a car, no public transportation to get her
Mhm.
at least frequently to other locations. She had a second job because she was lower income and casually employed. She could not afford to take time off of the second job, and she had a number of pets whom she said she could not get paid alternative care for. So those are the circumstances that she's dealing with. And so, from my perspective, it's no surprise that she turned down the residential treatment program. But the employer just took her no as the end of that conversation. Do you have any thoughts on how they might have approached that situation differently to get her the benefit of a treatment program, which was the original intention?
Yeah, I want to go back to something that I think we already mentioned. It, yes, there may be a no at the
Hmm.
start, right? We have to also, you know, with all the control issues we talked about, the lack of trust,
Yep.
etc., right? And so, yes, there may be a no at the start, but that conversation is something that the employer and others in the workplace can continue. The monitoring can continue. It's not just a no, therefore I'm not going to do anything about it, right? In this case too, it's really important to understand that rural communities really present distinct challenges in addressing gender-based violence, including intimate partner violence. So often there is, I think I mentioned this, a lack of access to resources. There's a lack of shelters, lack of housing, lack of
Hmm.
transportation. You know, there's transportation barriers, especially within the geographical area of the employee or of the workplace as well. There are also privacy concerns. Those are very real, especially in small
Hmm.
communities where lots of people know each other,
Right. Yeah.
right? So they know the employee who's experiencing the abuse. They know the abusive partner as well. Um, the case also indicates that, like you were saying, that the employee was precariously employed on a casual
Hmm.
basis.
Yeah,
She also was working, I believe, a second job as
that's
well.
right. Yeah.
So you know, a residential treatment program would likely have been beyond her financial means, and you know, taking the time off of both jobs would have increased this financial burden, and you know, and placed her at risk of losing likely both her jobs. And so this
Right.
is, I'm sure, something that she has been, you know, going through her mind. This, it could be particularly amplified if there's financial abuse in in the relationship as well. If he
Hmm.
is, for
Yeah.
example, you know, taking her money, if he's controlling everything that she spends, that's part of the coercive control part,
Yeah.
right? All those kinds of things. So she may actually have even less possibility financially.
Yeah.
Right? So again, living in a rural community may make it even more difficult for individuals to find alternative employers. Often there might be a one, big employer within the
Yes.
organization, right? And very,
Hmm.
very difficult if she loses her job to find alternative um, um, employment as well.
Yeah.
And there are other options as well. Employers can, like I was saying earlier, they can form relationships with shelters. Maybe a treatment and a residential treatment program wasn't for her in that moment,
Hmm.
but does it mean that there are not a lot of other possibilities to get her help? So shelters, often people think that they have to go to a shelter and stay in a shelter,
Yeah.
right? But they can offer also supports. Other community-based organizations within the community can also, right, offer some
Hmm.
supports, can
Hmm.
work with workplaces, with employers, and work with them to support the employee who's experiencing intimate partner violence. And again, through those risk assessments, the safety planning, for example, maybe there's some other kinds of supports that can be offered. Like I said, not just a residential treatment program. So it's again going back to that collaboration, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's absolutely key. Form those relationships, have a plan in place. Sometimes one thing we've done with organizations, we do a what if exercise, right? You get this big whiteboard, get all your
Mhm.
people in your community, in your committee that we were talking about, right? And say, okay, what if we get a report that looks like this, if we get a disclosure that looks like that, what do we have in place? What do we
Mhm.
not have in place?
Mhm.
What would we like to happen? What would we like not to happen?
Right.
Right? What is the kind of workplace that we want to be
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
for people who are experiencing harm?
Yeah. I do want to put just one factual clarification just for the audience because I
Yeah.
didn't share the case. The residential treatment program was being offered fully paid by
Oh,
the
okay.
one employer. That doesn't change at all the impact on your answer. I think that
Yeah.
you had very valuable insight on that. I just wanted to put that on the record because I
Yeah.
didn't share the actual link to the case because I didn't want to name the individual. Um, so that brings me to the end of my questions for you, Adriana. Did you have any other final thoughts that you'd like to share before we call it a day?
None that come to mind. Just reach out, form those relationships. Yeah, just go onto our website. There is so much at learningtoendabuse.ca,
Mhm.
and it's not part of the job.ca. And there are so many resources, and any questions, reach out, I would just say. Yeah.
And I'll be sharing links to some of those services on the last day of the 16-day series so that people have access to that because certainly your organization, I think, is the best one in terms of providing a range
Thank
of
you.
resources for employers in learning how to support their workplace and their colleagues and trying to make it better for
Yeah.
everyone.
And I know that there's so much information that we're bombarded with every day. And so,
Yeah.
one thing to do is also just sign up for the center's mailing list. And so when anything new comes,
Yeah.
and which is often, you just kind of made aware of it. And if you think, "Oh, okay, I think I might just, distribute this in the workplace." Sometimes it's infographics, posters,
Yeah. Yeah.
vignettes, like all different kinds of things. And if it's helpful, then yeah, use it
That's a
for
great
sure.
idea. I'll be sharing links to that too. Well, thank you so very much again,
Thank you.
Adriana. This was
Thank you.
just really wonderful and so great to have your expertise on this. It's an area that I think a lot of employers don't necessarily have insight into, whether
Yeah.
that be a lack of awareness or like we were talking about today, just thinking that it can't happen to them. So
Yeah.
your input, thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for bringing attention to this really important issue for employers.